1990. 31-year-old Peggy Marshall was at the peak of her career. Armed with a degree in physical therapy, she founded a geriatric clinic in Newport Beach, California. Peggy was passionate about her work, enjoying helping her elderly patients, but what she truly longed for was love. Her dream came true that same year when she met 24-year-old volleyball player Eric Beckler. Peggy and Eric both loved sports, which became their shared passion. Just a few months after meeting, they became inseparable. They lived together in Peggy's apartment and worked together at her clinic. Eric handled the finances, while Peggy provided physical therapy services. Together they made a great team, and the business quickly grew, along with their bank account. Before this, Eric didn't have much of a career, but thanks to his girlfriend, his financial situation improved dramatically, and he enjoyed a stable and wonderful life in a great neighborhood. Soon after their magical wedding ceremony, Peggy Beckler learned that she was expecting a child. But the growing family didn't significantly change their lifestyle. The couple simply brought their daughter with them to the beach. Not long after their first child, a second arrived, and the family moved into a beautiful home they bought for $1 million. They hired 2 nannies, one for weekdays and one for weekends, especially since a third child had arrived. This was the big family Peggy had always dreamed of, like the one she grew up in herself. Thus, the 5th anniversary of the Becklers' marriage quietly arrived. On July 6, 1997, Gary Green, along with a large group of friends and family, was heading from Newport Beach to Catalina Island on his boat when he noticed a boat circling in the ocean. Nearby, a man on a surfboard was struggling in the water, calling for help. Gary Green threw him a life jacket to keep him from drowning and called the Coast Guard. When they arrived, they saw the boat displaying a phenomenon known as the Circle of Death. This happens when the person controlling the boat lets go of the steering mechanism while the engine is running and the propeller is still spinning. Ideally, the operator should be connected to a safety lanyard, which would immediately shut off the engine if they were thrown overboard. However, people often ignore this rule. So when the steering mechanism is released, the force of the spinning propeller creates torque, causing the boat to make sharp turns and continuously rotate in a circle. The Coast Guard was able to stop the boat. They also pulled the man from the water and brought him back to the harbor. He was freezing, panicked, and in tears. The man was Eric Beckler, and his wife, Peggy Beckler, had been on the boat with him. A rescue operation for Peggy immediately began. At that point, she had been in the water for less than 2 hours, and the Coast Guard was hopeful that the rescue would be successful. Peggy was an extraordinarily strong swimmer. At an early age, she was diagnosed with scoliosis and had to wear a back brace. She was only allowed to take it off while swimming, so she spent a lot of time in the water. Swimming became second nature to her. There was a very high chance that Peggy was at least keeping herself afloat while they searched for her. The key was to pinpoint her location as accurately as possible. To aid the rescue operation, the Coast Guard spoke with Eric. He was distraught, shaking, and crying, but he managed to explain that they had been celebrating Peggy's birthday and their 5th wedding anniversary that day. In the morning, he woke his wife up and announced that they were going to the beach. There, a surprise awaited her. Eric had rented a speedboat with a fairly powerful engine. However, it was easy to handle, even for beginners. The couple initially planned to swim in the harbor, but soon grew bolder and ventured farther into the ocean for some excitement. For a couple with no experience in ocean boating, renting a speedboat and heading out into the ocean was quite ambitious. But they were enjoying their time. They had a picnic, drank margaritas, and made love. Eventually, they decided to head back. Peggy was at the helm, while Eric wanted to take one more ride on a boogie board. This type of surfing involves catching a wave while lying on your stomach on a relatively small board. As they approached the harbor, they were hit by what's known as a rogue wave or a killer wave, which completely engulfed Eric. When he resurfaced, Peggy was no longer on the boat. The boat itself was circling, making it impossible to get close. He couldn't swim away either, as he was still hoping to see Peggy on the water's surface. The Coast Guard officers were slightly puzzled by the fact that the weather conditions that day were surprisingly favorable for a sea trip. There were no waves and only a light breeze. They mentioned this to Eric, but he stood by his story. The investigators didn't argue. Although there had been no reports of rogue waves, they could have gone unnoticed. The ocean is an unpredictable place. Even in calm weather, many factors, wind, currents, tides, can combine to form unexpected, sometimes deadly waves. Hours passed. Evening came. But the Coast Guard helicopters and boats continued to search for Peggy. Even Navy submarines joined the search efforts. As night fell, confidence in a successful rescue began to fade. If the current had carried her away, she could have ended up in Santa Barbara or even Mexico. Peggy Beckler was searched for relentlessly for several days, but in the end, the difficult decision was made to call off the search. The Coast Guard focused on examining the boat. First, they made sure there were no mechanical issues that could have caused the accident. Then, they tried to recreate the situation the couple had been in. All the experiments showed that no matter how the boat rocked, the person steering it should have fallen inside the boat, not into the water. There was another odd detail. A pair of sunglasses was found near the steering mechanism. If Peggy had been swept away by a wave, the glasses should have fallen overboard, along with other items which should have been in disarray, but nothing of the sort was observed. Suspicion grew, and the Coast Guard asked the Homicide Investigation Department to look into the case. It was only later that forensic experts examined the boat. However, since the Coast Guard initially treated the case as an accident, most of the evidence had been lost. Under the mattress, the investigators found a small stain that looked like blood. The amount was too small to extract DNA or even determine the blood type. They couldn't even confirm if it was human blood or from a fish. Nevertheless, this didn't stop the investigators from questioning Eric about the discovery. Eric explained that his wife was on her period, and since they had been intimate, something could have gotten on the mattress. A reasonable explanation, but the detectives weren't ready to take his word for it. The boat was treated with luminol to detect traces of blood, and they found a whole pool of blood that had been carefully cleaned. It was invisible to the naked eye. Unfortunately, too much time had passed, and it was now impossible to determine when the blood had appeared or who had cleaned it up. Besides, Eric seemed so distraught over his wife's disappearance. No one believed that he could have killed his beloved wife. Moreover, there was another theory regarding her disappearance. Peggy and Eric had been spending too much money. Eric hadn't made mortgage payments on their home for several months, and their financial situation had deteriorated. But at that moment, Peggy caught a lucky break. She was approached by representatives of another company interested in buying her clinic because it had achieved great success. Peggy was faced with a tough choice. She didn't want to sell her clinic for any amount of money, as it was her life's work. However, her husband felt differently. He wanted to get rid of all their problems and difficulties, take the money, and not work. After giving in to his persuasion, Peggy agreed to sell the business. But luckily for her, the new bosses wanted both her and her husband to stay and continue working at the clinic. This was a great solution for them, but the situation didn't last long. The new owners uncovered fraudulent schemes through which the clinic had been receiving money from insurance companies for services it hadn't provided. During the period in question, Eric had been handling the finances, but his wife, as the clinic owner, took the fall. The new owners found this unacceptable and fired both of them. But losing her job wasn't the worst part for Peggy. Her clinic had been draining money from medical insurance providers for years, and someone had to be held accountable. She was facing charges of fraud and tax evasion. These are federal charges, and theoretically she could have faced 10 to 15 years in prison. Peggy confessed all this to Eric's mother, Linda. This is why Linda was convinced that Peggy had staged her own disappearance. She believed that Peggy, being a strong swimmer, had jumped overboard, easily swum to shore, and then settled somewhere in Morocco or the Caribbean. Linda thought Peggy would only return once the statute of limitations on the federal charges expired. At first, Eric's actions seemed to confirm her suspicions. He recovered surprisingly quickly after his wife's disappearance. He then sent their 3 young children to live with Peggy's parents, giving them full custody. But if anyone thought that Eric would soon try to disappear and join Peggy, they were mistaken. Just 3 months after his wife's disappearance, Eric was already dating someone new. Her name was Tina New, a model and actress who appeared in TV shows. As Eric quickly ran out of money, he decided to become a web designer. To promote his company, he planned to participate in a professional expo. He needed a model to attract attention, and a photographer friend from his volleyball team recommended Tina, whom he knew. The two hit it off right away. When Tina met Eric, she was struggling with substance abuse. Her car was in the shop, her home had no electricity due to unpaid bills, and the job offer from Eric came at just the right time. In her eyes, he seemed like a hero, a successful young businessman, so polite and courteous. So when he invited her to come home with him that same evening, Tina agreed. Eric's home was luxurious, with ocean views from every window. Almost every wall in every room was covered with family photos, many of them featuring Peggy. Eric didn't hide what had happened to his wife from Tina. Overall, he seemed like a perfect prince to her. So when the police contacted her to inform her that there was something suspicious about his wife's disappearance and asked her to inform them if she learned anything, Tina didn't believe them. The detectives left her their card, confident that once the initial charm wore off, she would call them. And they were right. Eric's new business failed after just a year, and he was catastrophically short of money to maintain the lifestyle he was used to. He lost his home, and he and Tina moved into a modest apartment. He also tried playing the stock market, but things didn't go well for him there either. The creditors were calling non-stop. Their relationship deteriorated significantly. They fought, reconciled, and fought again. It was October 1999. More than 2 years had passed since Peggy's disappearance. Tina and Eric had a fight so loud that the neighbors called the police. When the officers arrived, Eric was not in the apartment, and Tina handed them the detective's business card, asking them to call him. She told the arriving detectives that when they last spoke, she and Eric had just started dating. She was in love with him and believed the story he had told her. But now, she was certain that Eric had killed his wife. Tina told the detectives that a few weeks earlier, she and Eric had been at home, and she was watching old television shows that featured her. While fast-forwarding through the commercials, she suddenly stopped on a segment that had somehow been recorded. It was a news segment about the disappearance of Peggy Beckler. The news report discussed the water current and the weather on that day, which was completely inconsistent with what Eric had told her. Tina looked at him and said, "You lied to me." The blood drained from his face. He turned pale. Eric admitted that he had seen his wife fall overboard but hadn't been able to swim to her in time. Tina asked if he couldn't or didn't want to. He replied, "I couldn't." Then he thoughtfully added, "Or maybe I didn't want to." A bad feeling began to creep over Tina, but she decided to brush the conversation aside. A couple of weeks later, Tina and Eric were relaxing at a club where they were using illegal substances. When they returned home, they were lying in bed, still not fully recovered, when Tina suddenly exclaimed, "Oh my God, you hit her in the head." She didn't even understand why she realized this so clearly. Eric even jumped. He asked, "How do you know that?" But she didn't know until he confirmed it with those words. Tina demanded to know how it all happened. It turned out that the day before the boating trip, Eric had prepared a cooler, dumbbells, trash bags, and everything needed for margaritas. Eric told Peggy that it was a surprise, so she didn't even look into the bag. They went out into the ocean. Peggy was just lying there, relaxing, sunbathing, when her husband approached her from behind and, according to him, hit her so hard that she didn't even feel it. Then the murderer folded his wife's body in half, tied her ankles, wrists, and neck together, put 2 trash bags on Peggy, and dumped her into the water with a weight of 30 kilograms. After that, he returned to the boat several kilometers closer to shore. This meant that the Coast Guard, helicopters, and submarines were all searching for Peggy in the wrong place. Tina told the police all of this, but her words weren't enough for even an arrest of Eric because she could simply be making false accusations against her ex-boyfriend. However, this wasn't the first time detectives had heard similar allegations against Eric. They had heard the same from his best friend, Kobe Laker. A few months after the boating incident, Eric's friend, Kobe Laker, went to the police with a lawyer. Kobe had already been questioned before, but now he confessed that he had lied when he told the police that the couple had a perfect relationship. Eric had repeatedly confessed to his friend that he was fed up with his wife and could no longer tolerate her. Eric considered his wife controlling and demanding. On the other hand, she was carrying the weight of the children and the business, while he just wanted to play volleyball with his friends. She brought money into the household, and he was happy to spend it. All of this Eric had shared with Kobe. One day, Eric directly asked his friend what he would think if Eric killed his wife. Allegedly, Eric was considering taking her out into the ocean and dumping her in the water in a barrel or something similar. When Kobe regained his speech, he asked if he was joking, and Eric replied, "Maybe." Kobe stated that he hadn't mentioned this before because he was scared and wanted to protect his friend. Thanks to the young man's testimony, the police officially classified the case as a homicide. But without physical evidence, including the victim's body, investigators couldn't proceed. They needed to get Eric to confess on tape. Kobe agreed to wear a recording device and meet with Eric, but he couldn't get his friend to open up. Eric remained calm and insisted that Peggy had indeed had an accident. The police had only Kobe's word against Eric's. That wasn't enough for an arrest. By the time Kobe testified, The police had long given up on the idea that Peggy had faked her disappearance to avoid fraud charges. In reality, she faced a maximum fine, not prison time, so it was unlikely she would have abandoned her beloved husband and children to hide in another country. Therefore, the police now suggested that Tina try to get Eric to talk so they could record his words and arrest him. She agreed because she was openly afraid of her boyfriend. On October 29, 1999, the police placed a listening device on the girl's back and another in her handbag. Tina and Eric met at a restaurant, with detectives positioned both inside the restaurant and outside in the parking lot. The girl was supposed to act confidently, but she was afraid that Eric would hug her and feel the device on her. Eric and Tina had a couple of cocktails, after which Tina got down to business. She told Eric that the police had come to her asking questions about Peggy's disappearance, so they needed to agree on how she would respond. The man simply replied that she hadn't been on the boat. That was all she needed to say. But that answer didn't satisfy Tina. She had always known that if anyone could get Eric to talk, it would be her. So she asked how it had come to this. Why didn't he just divorce his wife? Eric replied that he would lose money in a divorce and would never see his children again. His wife would take them away and wouldn't let him see them. But who was he fooling? Tina knew very well that as soon as Peggy disappeared, he had given custody of the children to her parents. Still, that was something. Tina continued to press. She asked how she could be sure he wouldn't do something similar to her if they continued to date, to which he replied that he would never do that again. This was not enough, but still sufficient for Eric's arrest. The detectives, of course, did not hear a confession from him because he demanded a lawyer. But when they searched him, they found a weight bench that was missing only the 15-kilogram weights. Together, they accounted for the 30 kilograms he had mentioned to Tina. The trial began. This was a unique case because the prosecution had no physical evidence of the man's crime or that Peggy was even dead. Moreover, Eric acted very cleverly, confirming that during his conversation with Tina, he meant the murder of his wife. However, he claimed that she liked bad boys and that he was trying to create that image. The prosecutor was well prepared and used all circumstantial evidence to convincingly demonstrate his version of the events of that day. Furthermore, the motive for the murder was indisputable and as old as time. Both spouses were insured for more than $2.5 million. Today, that would be the equivalent of nearly $4 million. This issue clearly concerned Eric because 3 months before Peggy's disappearance, he called her brother to inquire about the money. He wanted to know more about the policies and how the payout would work if something happened to his wife. Interestingly, a month and a half before her death, Peggy wanted to change the beneficiary of the insurance. She intended to exclude Eric so that the money would go only to the children. This indicates how little she trusted her husband in her final days. Of course, Eric did not receive the insurance payout anyway, because insurance companies are very reluctant to pay money to potential suspects. After 7 days of deliberation on February 1, 2001, Eric was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. After his wife's death, Eric did not receive the insurance money. Instead, he lost his home and income, and his new business failed. Indeed, Peggy was far more valuable to her husband alive. She was his ticket to a luxurious life, and even in the case of a divorce, he would have gained more than nothing. But evidently, he did not understand that. Not to mention the fact that murder itself is a terrible crime. Overall, he did not act very sensibly. No wonder his volleyball buddy said he must have had an accomplice because he was too foolish to come up with everything on his own. Not to mention that the police had no evidence, but his long tongue led to him spending the rest of his life in prison instead of playing volleyball on the beach.
In 2010, 39-year-old Veronica Baza was a rising star in Nashville's music and television industry. In 2009, she became so in demand as a producer that she was asked to work on a television awards show for country music artists, which was a major challenge for her. Veronica handled it brilliantly, giving her career an even bigger boost. Unfortunately, the demands of her job took a toll on her personal life. Veronica and her husband, Tim Bozza, had been married for 15 years. They met and fell in love shortly after Veronica moved to the U.S. from Italy in 1994. At the time, both Veronica and Tim were young and ambitious. The first 12 years of their marriage were wonderful. Tim ran a successful home renovation business, while Veronica worked part-time and pursued a degree in communications. 7 years into their marriage, they welcomed a long-awaited son, Jordan. Veronica's career developed much more slowly than Tim's, but when she landed a position as a music producer, it seemed like her growth had no limits. However, as Veronica's career was taking off, Tim's business was struggling, as the construction industry had been suffering from the economic downturn since 2007. In addition to the stress from new financial problems, Veronica's job required her to be present 14 hours a day. This was happening just as Tim suddenly realized he practically had no clients. By 2009, the pressure on the family had become unbearable, and the marriage started to crack. The two filed for divorce. When they separated, Veronica moved to an upscale neighborhood near Nashville, while Tim had to move back in with his mother. The divorce was not entirely amicable, but it seemed that the last contentious points had also been settled, and by September or October of that year, the divorce would be finalized. On the morning of August 29, 2010, Veronica and Jordan headed to church, planning to meet Tim in the parking lot after the service, as Jordan was going to spend a few days with his father. Veronica was carefully trying to hide her stress about meeting Tim, and was instead thinking about her own plans for the day. She and her new boyfriend Brian were planning to visit Fall Creek Falls Park. Veronica imagined the mountains and waterfalls, and by the time the church came into view, she had managed to relax a little. After the service, Veronica and Jordan walked out of the church and approached Tim. Although the couple initially agreed on joint custody, Jordan spent much more time with his mother than with his father. While this arrangement suited Veronica just fine, she wanted her child support payments to Tim to be reduced to reflect the actual amount of time Jordan spent with him. However, she hoped the lawyers would handle it as quickly as possible, as Veronica truly wanted to move on from this marriage. After exchanging a few words with her ex-husband, Veronica hugged her son and wished him a good time with his dad and grandmother. Getting into her car, Veronica headed back home. As she approached the house, she opened the garage door, drove inside, and was about to close the garage door behind her when her hand suddenly froze. She had noticed something in the rearview mirror. To get a better view, she turned in her seat and looked out the car window. What does that mean, she thought, but she had no time to contemplate what she saw. Veronica jumped out of the car and dashed toward the door leading to the kitchen. At 12:30 p.m., 20 minutes later, a dispatcher answered a call from a man who identified himself as Brian Robinson. He was at the home of his girlfriend, Veronica Boza. Veronica had been killed. No, he hadn't checked for a pulse. And no, he hadn't tried to perform first aid. Please, just hurry, he asked the dispatcher, giving the address. By 12:50 p.m., police and paramedics had already flooded the street in front of the light brick colonial-style house. Inside, detectives were standing in the living room, looking at the victim's body. Veronica was lying on her side on the floor, surrounded by blood that had already started to dry and thicken around the edges. She had been shot at least 4 times at close range. Even without the autopsy report, the abrasions on her arms, the car door left open, and the scattered contents of her purse in the garage made it clear that Veronica had initially tried to escape from her attacker, but then turned to fight back. Judging by the valuables and cash still in the victim's purse, robbery could be ruled out. However, examining Veronica's belongings revealed that at least one important item was missing: her white iPhone. At the same time, forensic investigators found a significant piece of physical evidence. At first glance, it seemed the killer had collected all the shell casings, but one had been missed. While the forensic team continued their work, the detectives headed for the door. They wanted to talk to Brian, who had not only discovered the body, but also reacted suspiciously to the situation. Although he had immediately called 911, he only checked Veronica's condition after the dispatcher asked him to. He then informed the operator that she had no pulse, ended the call, went to the bathroom to wash Veronica's blood off his hands, and waited for the police outside. Brian's initial shock had already given way to sadness. He went with the detectives to the station without any objections. The police wanted to know how his morning had unfolded and how he found the body. He explained that he had spoken to Veronica on the phone around 11:50 a.m. while she was returning from church. The detectives exchanged glances. If the phone records confirmed this, it would narrow down the time frame of the murder. The window shrank even further when they learned that after her call with Brian, Veronica had contacted a colleague. That call ended at 12:08 p.m. This meant that if Brian was not the killer, he arrived at the crime scene moments after the murderer left. Brian said that when he pulled up to the house, he immediately noticed that the garage door was open, even though Veronica never left it open. He also added that after speaking with Veronica on the phone, he stopped by a store to pick up snacks for their trip to the park. He left the store at 12:15 p.m. When asked why he hadn't tried to perform first aid, he explained that when he saw the blood and the gunshot wounds, he had no doubt that Veronica was dead. After checking her condition at the dispatcher's request, he couldn't bear to have her blood on his hands, so he washed them. Before letting Brian go, the police asked for DNA samples, fingerprints, and access to his phone records, to which Brian readily agreed. After speaking with Brian, the detectives acted quickly. They wanted to interview the next person on the list of suspects, so they got in the car and headed to Tim Boza's location. When Tim heard the news, he seemed more distressed about having to break it to his 9-year-old son than about his estranged wife's death. He left Jordan at his sister's house and went with the detectives to the station. Tim did not try to evade questions and spoke openly about the marital problems, which the detectives noted could be perceived as a motive for murder. They tried to pressure him, but Tim didn't fall for the tactic. He understood they were just doing their job and insisted that he had nothing to do with the murder. Moreover, he stated that he could account for his whereabouts that day, starting from the time he picked up his son at the church. Tim explained that after dropping Jordan off at home with his mother, he went to a hardware store to buy supplies for a renovation project and then stopped by a supermarket to get a soda for Jordan. He provided receipts and suggested that there might be cameras at the stores that could confirm he was there. Like Brian, Tim gave DNA samples, fingerprints, and allowed access to his phone records. That evening, while awaiting reports from the medical examiner and forensic experts, detectives examined the phone records of Tim, Brian, and Veronica. One number stood out in Tim's phone history due to its unusually high frequency of contact. It belonged to Tim's business partner, Corey Kittum. Corey had known Veronica for a long time, not just Tim, and had even lived with the family for a while. Although Tim had mentioned to the police that he had spoken with Corey several times that day, the detectives found the number of calls back and forth between them surprising. There were 13 calls on the day of the murder and dozens more in the days and weeks prior. After the murder, Tim received a message from Corey stating, "It's all done." Intrigued, the detectives looked into Corey and discovered that he had a history of legal troubles involving aggression toward women. That day, the detectives wrapped up their work late but felt satisfied with the significant progress they had made. However, by the next morning, that sense of optimism had faded. The alibis for the two main suspects, Tim and Brian, were rock solid. Tim hadn't been anywhere near his ex-wife's house, and Brian had left the store at 12:15 p.m., calling 911 at 12:30 p.m., leaving him only a 15-minute window, which wasn't enough time to commit the crime. Interviews with friends, colleagues, and neighbors also shed no light on what could have happened. One neighbor reported seeing a light-colored van or SUV on the road behind Veronica's house, but couldn't provide more details about the vehicle or the driver. The shell casing found in the living room, which matched the bullets in Veronica's body, could have been an important clue if the police could track down the weapon and identify who had used it. With the lack of solid evidence and mounting frustrations, the phone records and Corey's involvement seemed like the most promising lead. Believing that a deeper investigation of the smartphones and call logs could uncover new clues, the police enlisted the help of a technical expert for a more thorough analysis. While the specialist worked on Corey's phone, detectives decided to have a conversation with him. Knowing he might refuse to provide any information, they devised a plan to get him to talk. They approached Corey, explaining they needed his help to clear his friend Tim from the list of suspects. This tactic made Corey feel at ease, and he openly described how he had spent Sunday. However, the detectives were already aware from phone records that his account was not true, so they set a trap. They asked him the best way to reach him at any time, and Corey fell right into it by confirming that he always kept his phone with him everywhere he went. Then the detectives confronted him with a question about how he could explain his phone being near the crime scene. Corey became visibly angry and, unlike Tim and Brian, refused to grant the police access to his phone, saying it was locked in his car. The detectives then obtained a warrant, which allowed them to search his car and examine everything inside, including the phone. At this point, they had growing suspicions about Corey, but still lacked direct evidence connecting him to the murder. So he, like Tim and Brian, was allowed to leave. His phone was immediately handed over to the specialist for analysis. Meanwhile, detectives began verifying his alibi. His girlfriend, Jenny Eddington, whom he claimed to have spent the day with, said she had worked the night shift on the 28th and returned home at 7 a.m., finding Corey asleep in her bed. She added that around midday, when the crime occurred, she was busy preparing lunch for both of them. Exactly 2 weeks after the murder, Jenny contacted the detectives again. She stated that she hadn't been entirely truthful. On the morning of August 29, Jenny returned home after her night shift, not at 7 a.m., as she had initially told the detectives, but at 9:30 a.m., Corey was not in the apartment, and she had no idea where he was. Exhausted, she took a shower and went to sleep. She didn't wake up until nearly evening, when Corey woke her up and said he wanted to take her out to lunch. As they were driving to the restaurant, a white phone slipped off the car's dashboard and fell to the floor. Jenny picked up the phone and placed it next to Corey's black phone. She didn't ask what the phone was, knowing that her boyfriend was involved with different people, and not all of his dealings were entirely legal. After all, it was Corey who had convinced her to steal a gun with ammunition from her ex-husband back in July. He said that she might need it for self-defense, and she kept it in a red lunchbox in her car. However, her ex-husband reported the stolen gun to the police, and when Jenny tried to discreetly return it a few weeks ago, neither the gun nor the lunchbox was in the car. Only Corey knew about it, but he denied taking the gun. By the middle of the next day after the murder, Monday, August 30th, Corey was in a foul mood. He explained to Jenny that the police were interested in him in connection with the murder of his business partner's wife, and told her that she had to help him. To get rid of the pesky police, he claimed that he had been with her all day, and if necessary, she had to confirm it. Jenny agreed because she knew this was not a request, but a command. She knew it was better not to argue with Corey when he was in a bad mood. But when the media began to report details of the murder, she remembered the missing gun and the white phone she had seen in Corey's car. Fearing she might end up at the center of a criminal investigation, she called the police and told them the whole truth. What Jenny didn't know was that the investigators had already concluded that Corey was likely the killer. According to a technical expert, on the day of Veronica's murder, even though her phone had been turned off, the iPhone moved along the same route as another phone, which was Corey's black Android. Based on Jenny's new testimony, along with an analysis of the phone data showing Veronica's phone's physical location before and after the murder, the detectives were able to piece together what had actually happened. Sunday, August 29th was hot and sweltering, but inside the Catholic Church, the air remained cool. After the service ended, Veronica felt a sense of calm spreading through her. She and her son said goodbye to the priest who had supported them over the past year. Now, as they headed toward the parking lot where Tim was waiting, Father Brim smiled and reassuringly shook Veronica's hand. She smiled back and thanked him before stepping from the coolness of the church into the heat outside. Her killer was already waiting outside, watching as she and her son walked toward Tim. The killer had spent hours following Veronica on various occasions, waiting for the perfect moment. Finally, that morning, the situation seemed promising. The child would stay with his father. When Veronica turned and walked to her car, she appeared relaxed and unaware of anything around her, including her killer. This was unusual because Veronica's killer was a very large man, standing 6.5 feet tall and weighing almost 300 pounds. People always noticed him wherever he went. Normally, this kind of attention pleased him, but not now. The killer smiled, satisfied with how things were progressing. He watched as Veronica took out her phone and began pressing buttons while walking the last few steps to her car. A few moments later, she disappeared inside her vehicle and started the engine. As she pulled onto the road, she didn't notice the large, light-colored SUV that entered the lane a few cars away from her. The killer knew where she was headed, so he overtook her and drove quickly to Veronica's house, arriving before she would get there. By this point, the killer had spent enough time following Veronica to know that she parked her car in the garage and then entered the house through the door leading from the garage to the kitchen. He also knew that she always closed the garage door immediately after arriving home. So he pulled into the alley and waited, preparing to act swiftly as soon as Veronica arrived and pulled into the garage, so as not to be cut off by the closing door. And indeed, as soon as she returned home, the man acted quickly. As the garage door slowly opened, he drove onto the driveway directly behind her. The killer glanced at Veronica's face in the rearview mirror and saw her eyes widen in sudden fear. Then he got out of his car, his hands gloved and his face covered. While the man calmly entered her garage, Veronica jumped out of her car, dropping her purse and spilling its contents on the floor. She then scrambled up and ran to the door connecting the garage to her house, opening it. Before she could get through the door and close it behind her, the attacker lunged and grabbed her by the wrist. The adrenaline coursing through Veronica's body allowed her to break free from his grip and rush forward. She initially fell onto the kitchen floor, but then got up and ran farther into the living room. As she did so, both she and her attacker, who was still behind her, knocked over tables, chairs, paintings, and items from shelves and walls. Finally, in the living room, Veronica's killer grabbed her arm again, turning her to face him while simultaneously raising a gun and shooting her. He fired at least 4 shots. Now the killer watched as Veronica's body bled on the polished living room floor, certain that the 2 shots to her head were fatal. He paused only for a moment to catch his breath. He quickly gathered the shell casings but made a serious mistake by leaving one behind. Then he made another mistake. As he ran out through the garage, he took Veronica's iPhone with him and jumped into his large SUV. Later that same day, the killer called a friend and asked how to unlock an iPhone and remove its battery. But for now, as he fled the crime scene, he simply turned the phone off, put it in his pocket, and drove as carefully as possible while leaving the neighborhood. Detectives needed to confirm that the gun was the murder weapon without having the actual firearm in their possession. First of all, Jenny identified the lunchbox where the weapon was found in Corey's car. Additionally, the detectives contacted Jenny's ex-husband and asked if he had ever fired his gun. He replied that yes, he had a farm where he sometimes practiced shooting. After nearly a day of searching, the officers managed to find shell casings on the ground. They matched the casing found at the scene of Veronica's murder. Finally, it was revealed that Corey had asked a friend to help him clean the gun he had taken from Jenny's car in the red lunchbox. Thus, the police were able to confirm Jenny's suspicions. Corey had indeed taken the weapon from her car and used it to kill Veronica. But this was not the end of the investigation. The police managed to uncover an incredible twist regarding how Veronica was killed, something one would expect only to see in a movie. It turned out that Corey was not the only killer of Veronica. Although the second murderer was very far from Bridgewater and never touched the weapon, it was Tim Bosa, Veronica's husband, who planted the idea of her murder. In late June to early July, Tim, feeling distraught and broke due to the divorce, began discussing a cross-murder scheme with his business partner and friend, Corey Katz, who was also struggling and facing relationship problems. They drew inspiration from the Hollywood comedy Throw Mama from the Train, where Billy Crystal's character agreed to kill Danny DeVito's character's mother, who, in turn, decided to kill Billy Crystal's wife. In fact, the comedy was a parody of Alfred Hitchcock's film Strangers on a Train, which was adapted from the novel of the same name. But unlike the film, where the protagonist's plan spectacularly failed, Corey and Tim believed they could succeed and set about executing it. The idea was that Corey would kill Veronica instead of Tim, and Tim would kill the ex-husband of one of Corey's girlfriends. However, Tim had no chance of carrying out his part of the deal. Aside from wanting to eliminate their targets due to the problems they were causing, there was also a serious financial motive. Tim knew that if Veronica was killed before the divorce, he would receive $550,000 from the insurance. He promised Corey $35,000 of that money. The Boza family financial advisor testified that on the day of the farewell to Veronica, Tim asked him when he could expect the payout. In February 2012, Corey was charged with first-degree murder and robbery with aggravating circumstances. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and an additional 25 years. A few months later, Tim, who testified against Corey, was also sentenced to life in prison, but with the possibility of parole after 51 years. The consequences of this murder were a shattered young life. There are numerous horrors in this story, but the main one is that Veronica can no longer be a mother to the son she loved so dearly. As of 2021, Jordan was living with his aunt in Tennessee and studying at college.
At 9 a.m. on Monday, October 31st, 2002, the owner of the trading company, Steve Canavan, opened the door of the warehouse located in the small town of Huyton, near Liverpool, United Kingdom, intending to start the work week. However, upon entering the warehouse, he immediately noticed bloody shoe prints. Following the tracks into a utility room, he discovered the body of a man on the floor. Steve realized there was nothing he could do to help. Blood was everywhere, and the deceased's face was disfigured beyond recognition. Officers called by Steve noticed a large gunshot hole in the warehouse ceiling. Comparing this with the appearance of the deceased and the mark on the back of his head, they concluded that he had been shot in the face with a shotgun. The head injury was so severe that identification was impossible. However, documents in the victim's pockets revealed the name Gerald or Jed Gilbert. Company owner Steve Canavan explained that 46-year-old Jed worked for him as a sales manager. He was his best employee, a talented salesman who would be irreplaceable. Jed's abilities allowed him to earn well and buy a wonderful Victorian-style house. Success, however, did not go to his head. He was a very pleasant, kind, and of course, sociable person, which was natural for such a job. Steve had no idea why someone would shoot Jed. However, there was a safe on the premises, embedded in the floor. The mat covering the safe was shifted, but it did not seem like someone was looking for keys or attempting to break in. Did Jed come to work during a robbery? An inventory of all items in the warehouse was needed to ensure nothing was missing. However, a more careful examination of the crime scene suggested another scenario. There were no signs of a break-in or forced entry into the warehouse. And when the forensic expert moved the body, 2 bloodied latex fragments were found underneath, likely from a glove. It seemed the killer was trying to create the appearance of a robbery to hide the fact that he came here with the sole purpose of killing Jed Gilbert. Jed arrived at work where the perpetrator lay in wait. When the man opened the door, the killer entered behind him. But why would someone want to kill an ordinary sales manager? Detectives decided to ask this question to his ex-wife, who had just arrived at the crime scene. Jed Gilbert and Ann Huxley met at a nightclub when he was 41 and she was 32. At first glance, they had nothing in common. Ann was born and raised in Kensington, not a very prestigious area of Liverpool where working-class people reside. She had been divorced twice and was raising a daughter and a son. Jed, on the other hand, lived a lavish lifestyle and had never been tied down by marriage. However, they shared an entrepreneurial spirit, both willing to work hard to secure a better life for themselves. Ann managed a network of small businesses, including coffee shops popular among the police, who enjoyed stopping by for a cup of coffee. Ann and Jed immediately liked each other and started dating. The man's family, his sister and mother, didn't approve of the girl, but the lovers paid no attention to it. A year later, Ann moved in with Jed, and in 1998 they got married. Unfortunately, in 2002, after just 4 years of marriage, they divorced. But they continued to live in the same house, under the same roof, just in different rooms. Apparently, their feelings had not cooled, and after some time, the former spouses reconciled and even wanted to remarry. But the day before, on Sunday, the man urgently left for work because he needed to resolve an issue with urgent delivery or something similar and did not return home. After Ann called all relatives, friends, and neighbors all night, she came to his workplace in the morning. Ann went into hysterics upon hearing that Jed had been killed. When she calmed down a bit, the detectives asked if she knew the reason someone might want to harm Jed. They were sure she would say no, but to their surprise, Ann answered yes. Jed was into gambling, a regular at the casino, but unfortunately, he was not a very lucky player. He had accumulated debts, and Ann feared that it would end with them losing their home. That's why, she claimed, she divorced him so that he couldn't dispose of it on his own. However, her husband still found a way to get the money. He embezzled £11,000 from the company he worked for. This meant that the police needed to have a more serious conversation with his boss, Steve Canavan. But that wasn't all. Ann revealed that after the divorce, she was seeing a man named Paul Gunning. Her new boyfriend didn't like that she and her ex-husband were still living under the same roof. Eventually, Ann got fed up, broke up with the man, but he wouldn't let go. In the end, she had to take extreme measures. She asked a friend to intimidate Paul Gunning to make him leave her alone. Thanks to Ann, the investigation gained a whole new set of leads. Perhaps Jed owed a significant amount of money to dangerous people, or was there a conflict with the employer due to embezzlement from the company? Finally, could it be a jealous lover deciding to eliminate a rival? While the police were exploring the most likely scenarios, the autopsy report arrived. The forensic expert determined the cause of Jed Gilbert's death, and it turned out to be completely different from what the detectives had expected. Although someone had clearly fired into the ceiling, there were no signs that the man had been shot. The cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head, and the brutality and force of the beating were simply unimaginable. Every bone in the victim's skull was broken, and there was a hole above the left eyebrow. The blows were clearly not inflicted with the butt of a shotgun, and when the police completed an inventory of what was in the warehouse, they found that only a fire extinguisher was missing. So the killer beat the man with a fire extinguisher and took him away from the crime scene. But who could display such cruelty? Jed's ex-wife believed that due to his gambling addiction, he had earned many dangerous enemies. The police investigated the casinos he frequented but couldn't find any significant leads. They failed to establish a connection with casino owners or debt collectors. Moreover, wouldn't Jed be more valuable alive if they wanted him to repay his debts? On the other hand, there was the man's boss, Steve Canavan, from whom Jed had stolen 11,000 pounds. However, the police faced another setback here. Steve denied that he would kill an employee over 11,000 pounds, especially an employee who brought him much larger profits. Steve even admitted that Jed was irreplaceable. Therefore, he simply demanded the stolen amount back and deducted the money from his salary. At the time of the murder, Jed had returned 5,000 pounds. Finally, Steve had a confirmed alibi, and detectives had to acknowledge that nothing pointed to the man's involvement. There was one more potential suspect mentioned by Anne Huxley, her ex-boyfriend, Paul Gunning. Anne thought it was possible that Paul Gunning might have wanted to get rid of Jed to take his place. However, during the conversation with the detectives, Paul vehemently denied any involvement in the case. He spoke openly and directly to the police. Yes, he had a romance with Anne, but it remained in the past, and he had no grievances against her ex-husband. He also had a solid alibi for the time of Jed Gilbert's death. While detectives couldn't find anything linking Paul Gunning to Jed's murder, the man provided them with a very unexpected piece of information. He used to own an escort agency, and a few years ago, Anne Huxley came to work for him. Apparently, she was not devoid of entrepreneurial spirit, as she quickly not only bought the agency from him, but also opened 4 more. The network of stores and coffee shops, including the one frequented by police officers, was just a successful cover for Anne's expanding business, and it was far from the business she claimed to be involved in when talking to the police. It's not entirely clear what prompted the detectives to also speak with Anne's friend, whom she asked to intimidate Paul Gunning. However, after talking to him, they encountered a big surprise. The man, also named Paul Eaton, worked as a bouncer in a nightclub in Birkenhead near Liverpool, where Anne was looking for a place for her next escort agency. They met and became friends there. But according to the 40-year-old man, they were not just friends. Anne was his fiancée. The man admitted that he was in love with Anne, and during a trip to South Africa, he proposed to her, and they got engaged. In other words, it might not have been Paul Gunning, but Paul Eaton who could be jealous of Anne's ex-husband, with whom she lived under the same roof. However, the man replied that he had no reason to be jealous because Anne accepted his proposal, as if that explained everything. Detectives asked him about his whereabouts on the night of the murder, and that's when Paul Eaton started talking nonsense. He claimed that his mother fell ill, he became upset, and seeking support he called a friend, another Paul Lewis. They got into a car to go to Wales, but on the way, the car started making strange noises, and they had to turn back. They went to a bar, had some drinks, and when they left the bar, the car wouldn't start at all. Investigators verified the alibi with his friend, 36-year-old Paul Lewis, also a bouncer at the bar, who confirmed his friend's words. Although there was nothing particularly fantastic in this version of events, investigators did not believe it. And what also bothered them was that if Anne could easily lie to the police about her fiancé, what else was she willing to lie about? In other words, she immediately classified her ex-boyfriend as a potential suspect, but strangely forgot to mention the man she was planning to marry. Furthermore, according to Anne, she and her husband had reconciled and were planning to remarry, and she referred to Paul Eaton as a friend who had done her a favor. So what was really going on? After examining every detail of Anne's testimony, investigators confirmed that on that fateful day, she spent time with her family, making several calls to Jed's relatives and friends, expressing concern for him. She even called her fiancé, precisely at the time when, according to his account, they were heading to Wales with a friend. However, the ping from his phone showed that he was actually in the vicinity of the crime scene. Suspicions about Paul Eaton's involvement grew, but what role did his fiancée play in all of this? According to Anne, in early 2002, her husband's gaming addiction forced her to divorce him to avoid losing their house, but they tried to mend their relationship. However, when investigators spoke to the man's relatives, they painted a completely different picture. The man's addiction didn't scare Anne, it infuriated her, so there was no talk of reconciliation. She filed for divorce because she was disgusted by her husband and she had had enough of him. Anne didn't leave the house because he paid for the roof over her head, but treated him like a doormat. After the divorce, they slept in separate rooms, and Anne occasionally brought other men home. This seemingly tormenting situation for Jed lasted for months until everything suddenly changed. One of Jed's friends told the police that in the summer of 2002, he had dinner with the former spouses and couldn't believe the positive changes in their relationship. They appeared to be a happy couple again. Anne affectionately embraced Jed and assured everyone that they were planning to remarry. Completely perplexed, investigators couldn't understand why Paul Eaton believed they were engaged when Anne was planning to marry her ex-husband again. Everything fell into place after examining the finances of the former spouses. One August day, Anne walked into an insurance office and took out a £400,000 life insurance policy on both of them. In the event of the sudden death of one of the ex-spouses, the surviving one would receive £400,000. She then went to a lawyer with a will in which Jed left everything to her. 6 weeks later, he was killed. Anne Huxley increasingly appeared as a black widow who lured her ex-husband into a deadly trap to collect the insurance payout and the house. Meanwhile, evidence against Paul Eaton and Paul Lewis was accumulating like a snowball. The owner of the nightclub in Birkenhead, where both men worked as bouncers, revealed that on the night Jed was killed, the men came to the club carrying a fire extinguisher. Perhaps they thought no one would pay attention to two bouncers with a fire extinguisher. The adjacent building to the club belonged to a hot-dip galvanizing workshop, which housed acid containers. The police contacted the workshop and requested the containers to be drained. There, they found the fire extinguisher. It was damaged but not destroyed. Immediately after this, the results came in from examining the latex scraps found under Jed's body. They were indeed pieces of a glove, with Paul Lewis's DNA. It was minimal, but enough to prove that Paul Lewis was at the crime scene, wearing gloves, and must have been involved in the murder. So, after 2 months of investigation, the police had gathered enough evidence against Paul Eaton and Paul Lewis. However, detectives were convinced that Anne also played a role in her ex-husband's murder. She had already persuaded Paul Eaton to attack her boyfriend. What would stop her from orchestrating another assault, only this time to get rid of her husband and claim his property and insurance? The challenge remained in proving it because all the evidence collected so far was circumstantial. On December 16, 2002, 6 weeks after Jed's murder, Paul Eaton and Paul Lewis were arrested and brought in for questioning. Paul Eaton didn't resist for long and admitted that he was at the warehouse, but claimed he went there supposedly to warn Jed to stay away from his fiancée. However, Jed reacted aggressively, suddenly pulled out a shotgun and pointed it at Paul. With no other option, Paul had to defend himself. The men struggled. A shot was fired, and the bullet hit the ceiling. Then, Paul Eaton reached for the fire extinguisher hanging on the wall and struck his opponent with it. After the commotion, his friend rushed in. Paul Lewis confirmed that he was waiting in the car outside when he heard a loud noise and ran inside. There, he saw the victim on the floor, and Paul Eaton beating him with the fire extinguisher. It was not entirely self-defense, since Paul Eaton came to the warehouse on his own, but he presented the situation as if it was a quarrel and claimed no guilt in the murder. However, this story did not explain why Paul Lewis ran to the warehouse in latex gloves and how they ended up torn under the victim's body. Both men also remained silent about Anne. Therefore, when she appeared at the police station the next day, she confidently told the same story as before. She claimed to be mourning her husband, and there was no reason to suspect her of the murder. Supposedly, Paul Eaton was so infatuated with her that he decided to commit murder, and she knew nothing about it. As for the insurance and the will, these documents were arranged in the interests of her children. If anything were to happen to her, they would be financially protected. The police had nothing to counter her argument. Fortunately, as it often happens, the killer cannot keep their crime a secret. A witness, to whom Paul Eaton confessed everything, came forward to the police. In reality, he entered the warehouse with a shotgun, intending to shoot Jed. However, at the last minute, he couldn't bring himself to commit the crime. Paul Eaton was a strong man, a bouncer at the club, but not a criminal, and he lacked the courage to kill someone face to face. Jed seized the weapon, and a struggle ensued. It's unclear how it would have ended, but Paul Lewis came to his friend's aid. He grabbed a fire extinguisher and began beating Jed. At some point, Paul Eaton might have taken control, although detectives believe that Paul Lewis was responsible for all the fatal blows to Jed. Leaving the lifeless man on the floor, the accomplices left. The witness stated that the accomplices did it for money, and promised the men £100,000 collectively for committing the crime. The witness's testimony not only provided the police with enough evidence to charge Paul Eaton and Paul Lewis, but also confirmed the police's suspicions that the mastermind behind it all was the Black Widow, Anne Haxley. As if that wasn't enough, another witness came forward, providing testimony against the accomplices. On that fateful evening, he agreed to give his friends a ride to the warehouse, thinking they needed to repossess a car due to unpaid debts. There was a van near the warehouse, and the witness assumed that the men would take it. This didn't surprise him at all, as they had previously performed similar tasks for insurance companies. According to his account, Paul Eaton and Paul Lewis asked him to park nearby and simply wait for a call. Interestingly, he parked right next to a mobile phone tower. After 20 minutes, they called and asked to pick them up. Only when they got into the car did the man realize that he had allowed himself to get involved in something unpleasant. The men were discussing an attack on someone, and he noticed blood on one of their shoes. There was enough evidence and witness testimony to charge both men with the murder of Jed and Anne with conspiracy to commit murder. The only thing the police didn't find was the shotgun the men disposed of. The trials began in April 2004. Since Paul Eaton was accused of delivering the fatal blows, he appeared before the judge first. Surprisingly, he shocked everyone by confessing to the murder. In England and Wales, this automatically leads to a life sentence. His decision sparked many debates and speculations. Some believed he got in too deep and would have been convicted anyway. Others thought he couldn't bear Anne's suffering and was trying to protect her. Unfortunately, she didn't reciprocate when it was her turn to testify. She happily confirmed that Paul Eaton took matters into his own hands out of jealousy because she and Jed had reconciled. Anne tried to portray herself as a modest housewife, but her efforts were unsuccessful. The prosecution effectively portrayed Anne as a Black Widow. Angry over her husband's gambling debts, she divorced him only to devise a deadly plan to enrich herself at his expense. She was willing to stop at nothing to get the house and £400,000. When Paul Lewis gave his testimony, he also tried to shift the blame onto Paul Eaton, despite the evidence suggesting otherwise. In the end, all three were found guilty. The men were sentenced to life imprisonment, and Anne received a 20-year prison term. The men were given the opportunity to apply for parole in 2020, but their release was denied. From the very beginning, the murder of Jed Gilbert, a 46-year-old sales manager, resembled the script of a Hollywood movie more than an ordinary criminal case. Relentlessly following the trail of evidence, detectives ventured into the realm of gambling, love triangles, escort agencies, and finally apprehended murderers driven by the desire for quick gain. Passion, greed, jealousy, betrayal, the list could go on indefinitely. This case had it all.
On Rachel de Jong's face, there is no trace of fear, only a radiant smile. The girl in a swimsuit with wet hair stands with four friends on the rocks amidst a small pond. Behind them, a clear sky and green forest. This is one of those photographs that captured the joy of a summer day, a perfect moment to cherish from their weekend trip outside the city. For Rachel's father, Kevin, it's difficult to look at this picture. They were having fun, and they simply didn't realize the looming danger until it was too late. Just a few minutes after Rachel took her final selfie, the 21-year-old girl tragically lost her life while trying to save her friend. On the morning of Monday, February 6, 2017, a group of friends began packing their belongings to head back home to Auckland, the largest city in New Zealand. The previous evening, they had spent their time at Lake Tikitapu, also known as the Blue Lake, where a big concert called Floshella took place. During the event, the audience listened to music while floating on inflatable boats and mattresses. There were 7 friends in total. Rachel, Gemma, and sisters Alice and Michaela came to the concert from Auckland. They all stayed at Rachel's friend Maddie's place in the picturesque countryside outside of Taupo. Sam and Reese, who were police officers and friends of Maddie's older sister, also spent the night at her house. After the concert, the young people had a very calm evening, had a few drinks, and then went to their respective rooms to rest shortly after midnight. In the morning, they all got up quite early to leave before the traffic jams that inevitably formed on the roads. February 6th is a significant national holiday in New Zealand. It's Waitangi Day, which commemorates the signing of the Treaty of Waitangi, considered the founding document of the country. Thus, traffic jams on the roads were quite common on this day. Once their belongings were packed, and the young people were ready to hit the road, one of them, 21-year-old Rachel de Jong, suggested deviating from the planned route before heading back home. She had heard from Maddie about a charming spot on the river, located just 15 minutes away from them and conveniently along the way to Auckland. This hidden gem was a relatively deep pool of water with unbelievably clear water, nestled right in the middle of the forest. The pool was part of the Waikato River, although the Waikato River itself was either very shallow or completely dry. As a result, this pool looked like a small oasis in the forest, filled with pristine blue water. There were no proper roads leading to it, but the locals had long established a trail from the main road to this enchanting spot. As Rachel's suggestion was met with agreement, they all thought it was an excellent plan. They split into 3 cars and around 11:40, they followed Rachel and Maddie, who were leading the way. Carefully parking their cars on the roadside, they followed the girls into the forest along a trail that started right by the main road. After about 15 minutes at 11:55, they realized they were getting very close to the river as the trees weren't as dense. However, at precisely 11:55, the friends suddenly came to a halt because an ear-piercing siren sound emerged from somewhere within the woods just ahead of them. The sound lasted for about 20 to 30 seconds and ceased as abruptly as it had begun. Puzzled, the boys and girls exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of it. Failing to come up with an explanation for the siren, they simply brushed it off and continued on their way. Just a minute later, they reached the end of the trail and found themselves on the edge of a not-too-high cliff that overlooked the water, which was their destination. Ropes were hanging down to help people descend to the water. The young people eagerly changed into their swimsuits and, despite the heat of Taupo, where the thermometer had risen to 33 degrees Celsius, they clambered down the rocks and held onto tree roots to get to the water. Once in the water, they enjoyed the refreshing swim in the central part of the water body, where 2 large boulders formed a miniature island. 5 of the girls climbed on these rocks to admire the view, take photos, and relish this unplanned diversion on their way home. At 11:58, the same loud and persistent siren sound echoed throughout the entire forest once more. It was the same sound they heard just 3 minutes earlier while walking on the trail. Again, all 7 of them looked at each other, trying to comprehend its meaning when, after about 20 seconds, the siren went silent. There were no signs of danger around them, nothing was happening, and they were surrounded by picturesque scenery, so they relaxed once more. Rachel was recording videos and photos with her GoPro, while the others took selfies. However, just 2 minutes later, precisely at 12 o'clock, the sound echoed once again. By this time, the friends had heard it twice, and although it was alarming as it sounded so loud and intrusive, since nothing followed after it, the young people quickly brushed it off. The siren ceased, just like before. But this time, something entirely different began to happen, and all 7 friends sensed it simultaneously. As soon as the siren subsided, a new sound emerged. It was coming from the same direction, upstream. Even though the river was dry, one could turn around, look up the flow's direction, and clearly see where the riverbed would be if it were full of water. The young people continued to stand on the mini island in the center of the water, listening to the loud, destructive sound of unknown origin. They exchanged curious glances, trying to comprehend what it could be when suddenly they saw it. A white wall of foaming water was rushing toward them at an enormous speed. By the time they realized it was a water wall descending downstream, it had already reached the water body, and the water level began to rise rapidly before their eyes. The water body where the young people decided to swim was not dangerous in itself. However, it became perilous due to its location in the area known as the water release, spill, and flush. Approximately 200 meters upstream from the water body was the Aratiatia Dam. 3 to 4 times a day, the dam gates were opened, releasing an enormous amount of water at a speed of 76,000 liters per second down the usually dry riverbed. Aratiatia Dam differed from most others in that typically hydroelectric stations are built close to the dam, just downstream, at the lower point of the river rapids. If this were the case for Aratiatia, all the rapids would be consistently submerged. However, to protect the environment, the hydroelectric station was built about 400 meters downstream from the dam. Water flowed from the dam to the station through a 10-meter wide riverbed channel. Opening the gates for the water release created an illusion that the dam didn't exist at all. The gates remained open for about 15 minutes, and one reason for the water release was to please tourists' eyes. It showed spectators what the river looked like before the dam was built, a raging torrent. Of course, the release of such a massive volume of water was hazardous. As per instructions from the authorities, the siren was supposed to sound 3 times, to warn people about the impending water release, 5 minutes before, 2 minutes before, and right before the dam gates opened. However, in case of unforeseen circumstances, such as the need to release water due to an unusually high water level, the siren wouldn't be activated. On February 6, 2017, the scheduled water release was planned for noon. Therefore, the sirens at 11:55, 11:58, and at 12 o'clock warned of the imminent opening of the dam gates. However, the friends had no knowledge of this because 2 weeks before Maddie, Rachel, Reese, Alice, and the others decided to swim at this secret spot in the forest, the warning sign about the Waikato River's danger was stolen. It was the exact sign that stood at the beginning of the trail through the forest. When the friends got out of their cars and walked towards the water body, they were unaware of the danger they were heading towards. Although Rachel and Maddie had learned about this spot several months ago, they were evidently only aware of its existence and how to get there. They had not walked down the trail themselves. Even though the Department of Conservation, DOC, knew the sign had disappeared, it had not been replaced. As the rocks on which the young people stood began to be submerged, they realized that this couldn't go on for much longer. Whatever this torrent was, it was soon going to engulf them and they needed to find safety. However, the fast-flowing water made it impossible for them to swim back to Sam on the shore. Their only option was to try to reach Reese, who was closer to them on the other side of the rocks. By this point, the raging water had reached the girls' knees, making it difficult for them to stand, let alone swim. They decided to take a chance and jump, attempting to grasp Reese's outstretched hands. Rachel took the risk first. She grabbed a selfie stick, extended it in front of her, and jumped as close to Reese as possible. He managed to grab the stick and pulled Rachel to safety behind him. Next was Maddie. She jumped, and Reese tried to catch her, but she slipped out of his grip. Moreover, he lost his balance and the current began to sweep him away too. Reese recalls that the water instantly separated them, and they were swept underwater. It felt like being in a washing machine. I had no control, I was running out of air, and honestly, I thought that was it. Michaela remembers how she was dragged underwater, hitting the rocks, and slowly losing her breath. I was under the water for so long, I was exhausted. But then I saw light and just swam up. While the two struggled for their lives, being carried away by the water, Rachel and Maddie managed to keep their composure. Rachel stood in Reese's place and once again reached for her selfie stick. She extended it and offered it to Gemma. Gemma jumped, and with her friend's help, she was pulled to safety. Only Alice remained. Rachel yelled for Alice to jump and grab the stick. Alice, who was nearly submerged, jumped and managed to grasp the stick but let go, and the current began to carry her away. At that moment, Rachel, who was in a safe position, leapt into the water after her friend. She grabbed Alice and tried to hold onto a protrusion but couldn't manage. The current carried both of them away. Gemma, Maddie, and Sam, who was still on the safe side, helplessly watched as their friends were swept away downstream. Tourists who had gathered on the bridge over the river, expecting to witness the popular water release, were horrified as they saw the water engulf the rock where Rachel and her friends had been standing, and several people being carried away by the raging torrent. Some even captured the terrifying scene on video. When the water flow finally ceased, the three friends who weren't swept away contacted the rescue service, and immediately rushed to search for the others. They found them. 3 miraculously survived, but 1 did not. The victim was 21-year-old Rachel de Jong, the very girl who was already safe but chose to jump into the raging water to save her friend. Rachel de Jong knew how to enjoy life. Talented, athletic, and intelligent, she was one of the top students at Long Bay College, popular among her peers. She loved spending time outdoors, especially near water. Her parents raised her to think for herself, and not be afraid to try new things. However, she always assessed the risks for herself and others. Her father, Kevin de Jong, said that he and his wife worked hard to provide the best start in life for their daughter and her 2 younger brothers. But nothing was handed to her on a silver platter. She chose to dedicate herself to the challenging work of rehabilitating patients with spinal injuries. She was talented, but she also worked hard, and selfless. She always valued others more than herself. That's why she is where she is now, Kevin said. Kevin saw photos and even videos of Rachel's final moments, taken by tourists. Each girl jumped into the water, one by one, until only the last one remained. With outstretched arms, she jumped into the water. Rachel grabbed her hand, slipped, turned to grab a rock, and disappeared from view. These photos and videos will never be made public. Kevin doesn't want his daughter's last moments to always be accessible or for survivors to constantly encounter reminders of that day on the internet. Kevin admits that it's very difficult for him to look at these images. They weren't silly girls taking selfies, Kevin says, disregarding the obvious danger coming their way. They thought they were safe on those rocks. They had no idea of the danger they were in until it was too late. They weren't stupid people. If intelligent people can fall into such a trap, there's a chance it might happen again. And that needs to be prevented. The grief of losing his daughter is compounded by the bitterness of hurtful comments blaming Rachel for what happened. Some people callously claim that there were signs and sirens, so there's no need to change anything and spoil the enjoyment of swimming in the waterhole just because Rachel and her friends ignored the warnings. Kevin, of course, disagrees with this. He believes that no one should be blamed for Rachel's death but wants someone to take action to prevent another incident. Changes have been made, the stolen signs, the ones Rachel might have seen, were replaced, and a large steel barrier now blocks the unofficial path. Ropes that visitors used to descend to the river have been cut. However, Kevin believes it's not enough and necessary to install cameras or use drones to monitor the river before releasing the deadly flow. Because the floods continue, and people keep slipping to the beautiful water hole hidden amidst the forest. Because the beautiful water hole amidst the forest continues to entice local residents and tourists who gather there, disregarding signs and barriers.
Bonnie and Jim Hood, an affluent couple from Newport Beach, California, believed they had fulfilled their long-held dream when they acquired the abandoned Camp Nelson Hotel in the Sierra Nevada mountains. However, during the hotel's restoration, Bonnie garnered many enemies among the local residents who opposed the changes. As tension escalated, violence erupted, resulting in 2 murders. But is everything as straightforward as it seems? At that moment, investigators had yet to realize that before the case would be solved, it would take more sharp turns than the serpentine road to Camp Nelson itself. Jim Hood, the son of one of the General Electric executives, and Bonnie Jean Marr met at the University of California. After their education, Jim accepted a civil service offer in Vietnam, while Bonnie worked as a flight attendant on planes transporting military personnel to Japan and Taiwan. Their long-distance relationship only deepened their feelings, and in the 1960s, they married and settled in Newport Beach, where they brought 2 wonderful children into the world, Mindy and Jim Jr. Jim quickly found success in real estate, while Bonnie pursued a career as a realtor. They weren't afraid of their own ambitions and embraced adventurous projects, which made them a fantastic duo. People believed they had earned their success through hard and diligent work. It seemed like things couldn't get any better. However, gradually Bonnie came to the realization that she yearned for something entirely different. She felt born for a life in the countryside and dreamt of settling near mountains. Mountains always held a special place in Bonnie's heart. When she was a child, her father would take the family to Camp Nelson for the summers. And when she learned that the old hotel there was up for sale, she immediately became passionate about the idea of turning the abandoned property into an exclusive resort that would attract affluent clients to the small town. At first, it was just a wild idea, but it so inspired her that Jim decided to help his wife make her dream come true. Jim and Bonnie acquired the hotel and embarked on an unexpected family experiment. Bonnie started dividing her time between the hotel in the Sierra Nevada mountains and her home in Newport Beach. Despite the fact that the family only gathered in full on weekends, Bonnie managed to be constantly present in her husband and children's lives. They regularly communicated over the phone, and she even checked the kids' homework, which they faxed to her. It was unconventional, but the spouses wanted each family member to be happy, pursuing what they were passionate about. Bonnie loved taking on challenges, tackling complex projects, and the hotel was one of them. Immersing herself in the work, she was driven. But being an outsider in the town, she had no idea what she had gotten herself into. Soon she clashed with the loggers who were clearing the forest on the hotel's grounds. At that time, logging was a primary source of income for many locals seeking to expand their businesses, but Bonnie stood against the destruction of the beautiful forest. As if this wasn't enough, during a horseback ride through the woods, she stumbled upon a different kind of enterprise, a secretive and highly dangerous one. She came across a clearing being used as a marijuana cultivation site. Bonnie reported her findings to the police. Tensions escalated to the point where Bonnie compiled dossiers on every person she had conflicts with. She simply wanted to mind her own business and thwart the illicit activities and destruction of the pristine forest. However, the locals believed it wasn't her concern, and that she shouldn't be assembling folders of dirt on people she found disagreeable. But despite quarrels and even threats, Bonnie fell in love with the hotel and the Sierra Nevada mountains. She was resolute in transforming the hotel into the spa resort she knew it could be. It was a challenging and ambitious project, and Bonnie hired an assistant named Rudy Manuel to help her out. Just 3 years later, with her husband's support, Bonnie was on the brink of opening the exclusive resort when a horrifying crime shattered the Hood family's world. At 3 a.m. on August 19, 1990, an unknown assailant broke into Bonnie's room and shot 2 people sleeping in the bed. Bonnie was shot in the temple and died on the spot, while her employee, Rudy Manuel, though wounded in the head, was still alive. Despite there being several $100s in Bonnie's purse and valuables on the table, nothing appeared to be missing. The murder seemed more like an execution than a random robbery gone awry. Apart from a shoe print on the floor, there were no other clues pointing to the killer. It became apparent that someone had come for these individuals, but whether Bonnie or Rudy was the target remained unclear. Though Rudy survived, the doctor's prognosis was uncertain. As a result, a police officer was stationed at the hospital in hopes that the injured man would recover. The residents of the tiny town of Camp Nelson were shocked when they learned about the brutal attack and speculated about the secrets the victims had hidden, prompting someone to resort to murder. The circumstances in which the victims were found left little doubt that they had crossed the line between friendship and intimacy. Bonnie and Rudy were discovered nearly naked in bed at 3 a.m. Moreover, the autopsy confirmed their intimate relationship. What drove Bonnie to engage in a romantic liaison with her assistant? Rudy was the complete opposite of James Hood. He worked with his hands, was a Native American, dressed casually, was comfortable getting into fights, and was accustomed to working the land rather than in an office. They spent virtually all of their time together during the 5 days of the week and gradually fell in love. Interestingly, those around them noticed this even before their relationship became a reality. The main question was whether Bonnie's husband had any inkling about the affair. Could he have discovered his wife's infidelity and sought revenge? However, during conversations with detectives, Jim seemed genuinely sincere, asserting that he had no knowledge of his wife's secret romance. Furthermore, he had a solid alibi. He was located 400 kilometers away from the hotel, at the family home in Newport Beach, along with his children. Jim appeared utterly devastated by his wife's loss, and though deeply affected by Bonnie's unfaithfulness, he demanded justice and a swift capture of the killer. All the family's friends and acquaintances unanimously attested that he was a devoted husband and father. Additionally, the police couldn't find any witnesses or evidence linking Jim to the crime scene. As a result, he was excluded from the list of suspects. Detectives spoke with Camp Nelson residents and discovered that Bonnie was far from well-liked. She was an unyielding opponent, successfully putting an end to both logging and the sale of illicit substances, actions that involved substantial sums of money. In other words, the victim of the murder was a woman who was vehemently disliked by the locals. However, after conversing with potential suspects, they couldn't find anyone who had acted on their animosity. Therefore, they decided to consider the crime from a different angle. Could it be that Bonnie had become an accidental victim, while Rudy was the intended target? Especially considering his own checkered past and brushes with the law. He had been suspected of assaults and thefts before. Not long before the shooting, he had been accused of stealing from a local landowner who had repeatedly threatened him. However, the landowner also had an alibi, leading to his exclusion from the list of suspects. But then, another possibility emerged. Stories began circulating about a mysterious stranger who appeared in town on the day of the murder. In a tight-knit community where everyone knew each other, an outsider stood out noticeably. Moreover, his appearance was distinctive, a tall, red-haired man with a beard. He entered a bar, drank heavily, and even got into a fight. However, the police had no idea of his identity, nor did they know whether he had any connection to the crime. Perhaps he had ended up in the town by pure coincidence. This was their first lead, and the one person who could help was Rudy. He might have seen the killer before the shots were fired. Rudy spent 2 days in a coma, and the police officers didn't leave his hospital bedside for a moment. Finally, he regained consciousness. Fortunately, he remembered everything and described the man who shot at him and Bonnie. It was a tall, red-haired, bearded man, the stranger that the locals had described. Now the police had a suspect, but he was a phantom, disappearing from the town as quickly as he had appeared. How do you find a person without a name? He had been drinking beer at the bar, which meant he could have left behind fingerprints. However, finding the right bottle in the bar was like searching for a needle in a haystack. Nevertheless, the investigators sent hundreds of bottles to the lab, hoping to find a fingerprint that wouldn't match any of the locals. The chances were slim, but sometimes luck is on the police's side. On one of the bottles, they found a fingerprint belonging to a man with a criminal record. He had a history of getting into fights, using both alcohol and illicit substances, owning weapons, and was likely involved in drug dealing. Rudy identified him from a photo. The enigmatic shooter was named Bruce E. Beauchamp. The police found Bruce at his home in Fontana, California. He didn't even attempt to deny that he had been in the town, even though he could have. He claimed he had come for personal business. Supposedly, he wanted to meet a woman discreetly without his wife's knowledge, but when he couldn't meet her, he drove back. The police were convinced Bruce was lying and that he was the one who shot the 2 victims. A closer examination of his life revealed even more intriguing details. As it turned out, Bruce could have known Bonnie because he had worked as a subcontractor for her husband for several years. However, he insisted it was just a coincidence. According to him, his boss had once mentioned that Camp Nelson was a great place to relax, and he finally decided to see it for himself, which is why he was at the bar that day. He had no dealings with Bonnie, didn't sell her drugs, they weren't in a relationship, and he didn't steal her jewelry. In other words, he had no motive to kill Bonnie. Still, Bruce was charged with first-degree murder. The shoe print found near the crime scene matched a specific brand of sneakers, and investigators found a receipt for the purchase of those exact shoes in Bruce's possession. With Rudy's identification, prosecutors believed they had a solid case against the accused. If convicted, the death penalty awaited him. However, when Rudy took the witness stand, he made a fateful decision to keep one secret. When asked if he had a connection with Bonnie, he answered no, despite the physical evidence to the contrary. He had no reason to lie, and this unexpected turn shook the prosecution. By denying the romantic connection, he cast doubt on all his other statements. And when jurors have issues with the victims, they can easily doubt the guilt of the accused, even if there's no real reason for doubt. That's exactly what happened. The jury found Bruce not guilty. He walked out of the courtroom a free man, although his freedom was short-lived. Nearly a year after Bruce's acquittal, a call came into the rescue service from Jim Hood's office in Fontana. Upon arrival, the police found Bruce Beauchamp's lifeless body on the floor. He had been shot 7 times, and the shooter turned out to be none other than Jim Hood himself. He didn't deny killing Bruce and had called the police himself. However, he claimed that his action had nothing to do with revenge. He said he was defending his life, as Bruce had barged into his office wielding a weapon and attempted to kill Jim, just as he had killed his wife, Bonnie. Friends of Jim mentioned that Bruce had been harassing him with phone calls for a long time, threatening to kill him. So Jim feared for his life and prepared by hiding a pistol in his desk drawer. Jim's lawyers were confident that the court would quickly establish that he acted in self-defense and would set him free. However, things turned out to be not that simple. Bruce might have been a villain, but he was also loved. His wife knew his secrets. She became the main witness for the prosecution and revealed that shortly before her husband's death, she found $10,000 in cash in the house. She demanded explanations from him, and he reluctantly confessed to her that he had killed Bonnie Hood for $50,000, as per her husband's request. But even if the police were willing to believe this, they didn't know Jim's motive. Was the woman killed because of her infidelity? Most likely not. There were rumors that Jim's empire wasn't as strong as he portrayed it, and his wife's dream of building a luxurious spa resort took a lot of money. The hotel cost $700,000, and the renovations were much more expensive than the spouses had anticipated. Although Jim agreed to buy the hotel as a gift for his wife, he was a businessman and believed that such a gift should bring profits, not just drain money from the family budget. On the other hand, Bonnie firmly believed that her husband had the money and continued to spend on her dream as much as she wanted. After her death, Jim received about $400,000 from the insurance, which could have helped solve his problems. But Bruce disrupted his plans. He consulted his lawyer and found out that he couldn't be tried for the same crime twice, so he had nothing to fear. He could publicly claim that he shot Bonnie and Rudy, and they wouldn't even arrest him. So he started extorting money from Jim. According to the prosecution's version, on that day, the men agreed to meet in Jim's office. A friend who drove Bruce to the office recounted that Bruce took out a knife to not appear threatening if Jim called the police. He expected a difficult conversation but couldn't imagine that he would be killed. James shot Bruce twice in the head and chest. As he fell, James fired 3 more bullets into the blackmailer's body, then another 2 shots at close range into his head. After that, he placed the prepared revolver in Bruce's hand. However, no traces of blood were found on the revolver, and the forensic experts concluded that it was placed in Bruce's hand after his death. Moreover, the weapon was found in his right hand, but he was left-handed. However, the prosecution's version had several gaps. Firstly, Bruce's wife, Sharon, couldn't explain what she and her husband had spent the money on for Bonnie's murder and why they couldn't cover their debts. Her husband didn't deposit money into a bank account, and Jim also didn't withdraw such amounts from his account. Even if the woman did see the money, her husband could have lied to her about how he obtained it. Secondly, according to Jim's friends and close ones, he didn't have financial problems. He was building houses worth $8 million each, had personal savings, and right before Bonnie's murder, he bought a new car for his son with cash. Therefore, in case of financial difficulties, his wife's $400,000 insurance wouldn't have helped much. Thirdly, Bonnie kept dossiers on all the local residents with whom she had conflicts. These documents disappeared and no one knows who took them. Neither Jim nor Bruce had any reason to steal them. More likely, it was the other way around. The jurors deliberated for 20 days, yet one of them still did not believe in Jim's guilt. The members of the jury couldn't reach a unanimous decision, so the court was declared a mistrial. However, the prosecutors made a second attempt to secure Jim's conviction. The prosecutor corrected his mistakes and did not attempt to prove the motive for the murder. He didn't mention Bonnie's murder, but instead presented the evidence. Additionally, during the second trial, Jim altered his testimony slightly, prompting an unexpected move from the prosecutor. He called the jurors from the first trial as witnesses, and they testified that Jim had lied. In the second trial, Jim Hood was convicted of Bruce's murder. Although the public and the newspapers accused him of Bonnie's death as well, no formal charges were brought against him for it. His children still believe that their father was not involved in their mother's death. They consider him an easy target for the prosecutors who wanted a guilty verdict in such a high-profile case. They are shocked by the fact that Bruce, a man repeatedly accused of crimes, was set free due to the jurors' lack of conviction, while their father, who was a great husband and father, ended up being convicted. The irony of this case lies in the fact that if Bruce had been convicted, he would be alive today. However, his acquittal led to his death, which in turn resulted in Jim's conviction. Jim's request to be placed in a medium-security prison was denied. He is serving his sentence in the most dangerous and isolated prison in the state. Bonnie dreamt of creating a luxurious spa hotel in the mountains, a place where she could truly find happiness. But she was killed before her dreams could come true. James, her husband, had all the advantages in life, with doors open before him. He had a beautiful home, a wife, and children. However, the desire to keep his secrets hidden undermined this life of wealth and privilege.